Welcome to Dialogue. This is part of a series on dirty politics. This episode continues with real-world and documented examples of dirty politics. Case 5 discusses the Lavon Affair. And today we are really plunging into a pivotal, yet somehow often overlooked, moment in intelligence history.
We are. And when we talk about political maneuvering, propaganda, leaks, all of that, it's easy to keep it theoretical.
Right. It's just proposals, memos that never went anywhere.
Exactly. That's the default setting, isn't it? To think, oh, the really crazy plans, they always get stopped. But what makes this case, the Lavon Affair, so vital is that we are not debating a hypothetical.
No, this is real.
This was conceived, authorized, staffed, funded, and then fully executed. It happened.
Okay, so let's frame our mission for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We're looking at a 1954 Israeli intelligence operation. But the key here, and I really want to stress this, is its failure. That failure, paradoxically, is what gives us all the insight. There's this idea that really stands out here, that dirty politics is just easiest to spot when it fails spectacularly.
Success covers its own tracks. It's masterful at it. Evidence gets burned, history gets sanitized. But failure blows a whole thing wide open. It leaves the blueprint just sitting there for everyone to see.
And the Lavon Affair is that exposed blueprint.
It is. The quick summary is, well, it's pretty shocking. The plan involved false flag bombings. They targeted civilian and Western institutions all across Egypt.
And the goal wasn't random chaos.
No, not at all. The strategic goal was to manufacture a crisis, to paint Egypt as dangerously unstable, as hostile to the West.
This was aimed directly at preventing Britain and the United States from pulling back their military and political commitments in the region. So it's about creating a very specific kind of fear.
A very specific kind. It was a direct attempt to force a change in foreign policy by injecting lethal chaos into what was, at the time, a peaceful environment.
It just shows the extraordinary lengths a state will go to when it feels its back is against the wall.
It does. This is, it's beyond just simple espionage. We're now in the territory of active, destructive measures that are meant to manipulate how the entire world sees a situation. The whole architecture of the deception is what we really need to trace.
So we have to start with the setting, the why. We've said this before in our deep dives, but dirty politics is rarely just a product of madness. It's almost always a consequence of what you could call strategic impatience.
That's the perfect phrase for it.
This operation was born from a desperate lack of normal diplomatic leverage. It's a foundational truth. Dirty politics really begins when your foreign policy goals lack that leverage.
And that anxiety was just palpable for Israel in the early 1950s. You have to try and put yourself in their shoes. A brand new nation, barely established, diplomatically fragile.
Surrounded by neighbors who were openly hostile.
Openly hostile. They wouldn't even acknowledge its existence. Survival felt like it was conditional, It depended entirely on having strong allies, especially in the West.
And right at that moment, the power dynamics in the region are shifting dramatically, mostly because of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt.
Exactly. Nasser was this revolutionary figure. He was all in on pan-Arab nationalism and, crucially, on dismantling what was left of colonialism.
So his main goal was getting the British out.
Completely. Expelling British influence, which had dominated Egypt for decades. For Israel, though, that British presence, especially that huge military base around the Suez Canal, was seen as a tether, a stabilizer.
An anchor.
A geopolitical anchor. So when Nasser starts pushing for British forces to withdraw, Israel sees it as a countdown to disaster.
It's a crisis of looming abandonment.
It absolutely is. The trigger for this whole operation was the negotiation between Britain and Egypt that led to the 1954 Anglo-Egyptian Agreement. That treaty laid out a phased withdrawal of all British troops from the Suez base.
And this wasn't just any base. We're talking tens of thousands of soldiers. The gateway between Europe and Asia.
So for the Israeli government, this wasn't just Britain leaving Egypt. It felt like the entire Western security buffer was about to dissolve. They were terrified of being isolated if the U.S. and Britain decided Nasser's new, non-aligned Egypt was a better bet.
And that's the leverage problem. They couldn't just call up London and demand they tear up a treaty with Egypt.
They had no seat at that table. Diplomacy was a dead end. So their only perceived option was to, change the facts on the ground, make Egypt look so toxic, so unstable, that the West would be horrified at the thought of leaving.
That is strategic impatience in action. Time is running out, the diplomatic window is slamming shut, and the only tool left in the box seems to be deception.
And that urgency, that desperation, it explains the sheer recklessness of the plan they came up with. They weren't just trying to influence people, they wanted a political earthquake.
To prove that Nasser couldn't control his own country.
Exactly, that Egypt was being overrun by radicals. It was a direct, violent attempt to shred Nasser's credibility on the world stage. That whole mindset negotiation has failed, so manipulation must begin. That's the absolute kernel of dirty politics.
Which sets up a huge question. If you're willing to risk your own agents, your own citizens in a hostile country, and risk global exposure, how certain were you that this would actually work?
Incredibly desperate. They were betting everything on secrecy. The whole operation was this high-stakes gamble that if they could create just the right kind of chaos and perfectly pin the blame somewhere else, the payoff would be worth the risk.
A crisis we create is better than the stable outcome we don't want.
That was the logic.
Okay, so that geopolitical tension, the why, leads us straight into the mechanics, the how. So what did this operation actually look like on the ground?
Well, in 1954, Israeli military intelligence, Amman, launched the operation. And like you said, this wasn't just about gathering intel. This was direct action.
Meant to destabilize a foreign capital.
And the blueprint is textbook false flag. Step one was recruitment. They used Egyptian Jews, local citizens, people with deep community ties who spoke the language, who could move around without raising suspicion.
It gives you a layer of deniability right away.
An essential layer. And their instructions were brutally simple. Plant bombs in civilian targets. This is where it crosses the line from political maneuvering into, well, state-sponsored terrorism.
But the targets weren't random. They were chosen with, what, surgical precision?
Surgical is the right word, but they weren't designed for mass casualties. They were designed for a maximum strategic shockwave that would be felt in Washington and London. High symbolism, low body count. That was the idea.
And this is where the planning gets really revealing. So what were these specific targets?
The list included U.S. cultural centers, British-owned buildings, libraries, movie theaters.
So notice what's missing. Not military bases, not Egyptian government offices.
Nothing like that. The focus was entirely on things that screamed Western presence. Culture, business, engagement. Bombing a British-owned cinema or a U.S. library sends a very different message than bombing an Egyptian police station.
It's a message aimed directly at an external audience.
Precisely. You attack a U.S. Information Service library, a place for cultural exchange, and you're attacking America's soft power in the region. The intended message wasn't that Egypt was hostile to its neighbors. The message was that Egypt was hostile to you, America, to you, Britain.
Right.
That it couldn't protect your people, your assets.
It turns a local issue into an urgent international crisis.
Instantly. And you mentioned something critical earlier, that the bombs were designed to cause property damage but avoid mass casualties.
Right. Why that distinction? It seems like a very fine line to walk.
It's a profoundly dark but subtle calculation. A huge, indiscriminate slaughter might trigger a global response that's too volatile, too unpredictable. What they needed was proof of radical instability, fear, not necessarily horror.
So a fire in a library suggests an organized, targeted campaign by extremists.
Exactly. It reinforces the narrative that Nasser has lost control, that his country is descending into chaos. It was chaos managed to a specific, marketable level.
Which brings us to the core of any false flag. The attribution strategy. Who gets the blame?
This is the key move, the essential deception. The attacks were to be explicitly blamed on rival factions that already existed inside Egypt, specifically Egyptian communists or factions of the Muslim Brotherhood.
So you're weaponizing attribution. You pick the boogeyman that will scare your allies the most.
You got it. Blame the communists, and you immediately set off Cold War alarm bells in Washington. Suddenly, Soviet-backed radicals are destabilizing the Suez Canal.
Or you blame the Muslim Brotherhood.
And you reinforce the Western fear of untamed Islamic extremism. Both scenarios gave Britain and the U.S. a perfect justification to reverse course, to stay in Egypt, to stabilize the situation.
So the objective was to convince them their planned withdrawal was not just risky, but suicidal.
Yes, that they would be abandoning their interests to chaos. This wasn't lobbying. This was actively manufacturing facts on the ground to get a policy outcome that diplomacy could never deliver. This is what a false flag strategy looks like when it's put into action.
And we have to think about the psychological weight on the agents themselves. They weren't just planting bombs, they were planting lies.
Knowing that if they were caught, there was no out, no diplomatic protection. They were facing capital charges, and their own government would deny their existence. Their lives were wagered on the perfect success of the deception.
So let's talk about authorization, because when an operation this reckless comes to light, the first instinct is always to say it was a rogue cell.
The classic defense. But that's not what happened here. This was run by Israeli military intelligence, Amon, under the full authority of the Defense Ministry.
This was a state-level institutional operation.
Without a doubt. You don't get the training, the resources, the target selection for something like this from a few low-level agents acting on their own. The political explosion that happened later inside Israel proves just how high up the chain this went.
A lot of the political drama that followed focused on one man, the defense minister, Lavon. The whole scandal even took his name.
Right. The big debate became, did Lavon personally give the direct order, or did a senior officer act without his explicit sign-off?
But that debate almost misses the bigger point.
It does. It obscures the core truth. While they were fighting over personal accountability, the institutional reality was that the state's intelligence apparatus was deployed to do this. The existence of the network, the bombs, the plan that confirmed state involvement at the highest levels. The fight over who gave the order was just a panicked scramble for deniability after it all went wrong.
And despite all that high-level planning, all the sophisticated political calculations, the entire thing unraveled because of something so mundane.
A catastrophic, simple failure. The turning point was one of the operatives, a man named Philip Nathanson. He was trying to plant a bomb in a movie theater in Alexandria.
And it went off too early.
It detonated prematurely in his pocket. It's the ultimate intelligence nightmare. In one instant, you go from a clandestine operation to a crime scene with undeniable evidence. The authorship becomes visible.
And that visibility is fatal.
Completely. The premature detonation leads directly to Nathanson's capture. He's interrogated by the Egyptian authorities, and the thread starts to pull. The network just unraveled completely. The whole cell was rounded up within days.
What happens in that moment? When the first agent is caught, it must be a race against time.
It is, and it's a race the planners almost always lose. The captured agent is under extreme pressure, facing execution. He gives up safe houses, codes, names. The agency back home is often too slow to realize just how bad the breach is, and that's the moment the whole premise of dirty politics just collapses.
Because it all relies on invisible authorship.
It relies fundamentally on it. Once authorship becomes visible, what's the outcome?
Total ruin.
Total ruin. There's no plausible deniability, no clean narrative. The story you were trying to sell, that Egyptian extremists are out of control, is instantly replaced by the truth. Israeli state deception. The whole thing backfires.
The very political goal of the operation, to make Egypt look unstable, is reversed. Now Israel's government is destabilized and embarrassed on a global stage.
That little bomb going off in an Alexandria cinema didn't just expose an agent. It exposed an entire strategic doctrine, and the cost of that exposure would haunt the Israeli government for a decade.
So the failure was immediate, and it was devastating, both for the people on the ground in Egypt and for the politicians back in Tel Aviv.
For the agents, the fallout was tragically final. They were put on trial in Egypt, charged with espionage and terrorism. The sentences were severe. Two of the operatives, Moshe Marzouk and Shmuel Azar, were executed. Others got long prison sentences. Some served more than a decade before they were eventually released in prisoner exchanges. That is the sharp, undeniable human cost when a deception fails and you become a political liability.
It's easy to get lost in the political intrigue, but these were real people executed by a foreign government for following orders.
And their orders, by design, offered them zero protection if they were caught. Their lives are the bet.
Meanwhile, back in Israel, the scandal was volcanic.
Massive political scandal doesn't even begin to cover it. In Israel, it became known as Isaac Habish, the shameful business, and it ignited a decade of the most intense political infighting imaginable.
It started with the defense minister, Lavon, resigning.
His resignation was just the beginning. The whole governing party was fractured by the endless investigations and blame shifting. It became a deep personal feud between Lavon and David Ben-Gurion, the founding father of Israel.
So this one failed false flag operation didn't just fail. It destabilized the internal politics of the country that launched it for years.
For years. It triggered multiple inquiries, destroyed careers. The integrity of military intelligence was shattered. Trust between the political leadership and the security services just evaporated. This is the key takeaway. When dirty politics gets exposed, it doesn't just damage the target, it corrodes the system that deploys it.
That corrosion is the price of institutional dishonesty.
Exactly. When you bypass your own democratic controls to run a covert op, you create a toxic precedent. And when it fails, the investigation isn't about finding the truth, it's about political survival.
The state ends up spending years fighting itself.
It's a textbook example of how a reliance on deception guarantees instability, even for the architects of that deception.
So despite this absolute catastrophe, executions, resignations, political chaos, there's a grim irony in how the Lavon Affair is often remembered.
Yes, the framing of it is really important. Historically, it often gets filed away as just an intelligence failure, or a botched operation, a Cold War miscalculation.
Language that suggests the only mistake was getting caught.
Exactly. It implies the only lesson to be learned was, be better at this next time.
But focusing on the technical failure lets everyone off the hook from the more terrifying conclusion. The operation failed, but the underlying logic survived.
Absolutely. The operatives were caught because of a premature detonation, a tactical error, but the logic, the core idea that you can use civilian spaces as geopolitical tools, that you can manufacture attribution to manipulate public opinion, that logic survived the wreckage completely intact.
So the lesson wasn't, we shouldn't stage false flags. It was, we need to stage false flags with better detonators.
And better escape plans and deeper layers of political protection. The failure just taught the method to be more careful, more sophisticated. The willingness of a state to do something like this had been proven, and once that's proven, the option stays on the table for the next leader facing a moment of strategic impatience.
Which brings us to this grim irony of it all, the banality of chaos. Why does dirty politics always assume perfect competence?
It's pure hubris. It's built on this illusion of control. Every one of these high-stakes operations assumes no mistakes, perfect secrecy, controllable outcomes.
But as the Lavon Affair proved, chaos does not follow a script.
Not at all. The entire plan was to inject a controlled amount of chaos into Egypt to get a stable outcome for Israel. But the smallest, most unpredictable thing, a faulty wire, maybe unleashed an uncontrolled cascade of chaos back onto them. They couldn't even control the timing of one small bomb in one agent's pocket.
It's the ultimate reality check. You're leveraging human fallibility for a political goal, and human fallibility is indifferent to your strategy.
And the greater the deception, the more variables you introduce, and the higher the risk of exposure from some tiny, unforeseen flaw. The chaos they wanted to weaponize against Egypt ended up being the very thing that dismantled their own political house.
So the Lavon Affair gives us this crucial data point. We can actually see a clear, reusable playbook here.
We can. First, political objectives come before consent. The need for security or leverage is prioritized over everything else.
Second, covert action manufactures urgency. When diplomacy is too slow, you create a crisis, a false flag, to force everyone's hand.
Third, attribution is weaponized. You pin the blame on whoever is most convenient for your narrative. In 1954, it was communists or Islamists.
And finally, when it's exposed, the perpetrators become liabilities. From the agents who were executed to the minister who resigned, they all become disposable the second that invisibility is lost.
This connects directly to other cases, especially something like Project Northwoods in the U.S. Northwoods was the proposal for false flags memos about sinking American boats and blaming Cuba. It was the theory.
And Lavon is the real-world, tragic execution of that theory. It proves these ideas move from a whiteboard into live action with deadly consequences.
And the logic is incredibly adaptive. In 1954, you needed a real bomb and real property damage to get a headline. The tools are changing.
The payload shifts.
Exactly. We're moving from the kinetic false flag to the informational one. The playbook today might use deepfakes or engineered social media panics. You replace explosives with viral narratives. The goal is identical. Manufacture crisis, outsource the blame, manipulate perception. But the risk is lower, and the deniability is so much higher.
So the failure of the Lavon Affair didn't kill the strategy. It just taught it to be smarter, more insidious.
It forced the method to hide better. And this all circles back to where we started. Strategic impatience. This case proves dirty politics isn't an accident. It's the predictable outcome when leaders feel they're out of time and out of options. Failure, as we see here, doesn't end the method. It just teaches it to wait for the next moment of desperation to come back, stronger and harder to detect.
Which leaves us with a really unsettling question. If the pressures of the 1950s led to this, what kind of operations are being deployed or proposed right now in our era of digital deniability? That is the enduring and frankly chilling logic of the Lavon Affair. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.